Welcome back to the final hour on a Wednesday morning, the Gary Sutton Show here on WSBA. I'm not going to take any callers during this half hour because I want to spend some time with our guest, but I will take callers afterward, and you are welcome at 11:35 at 1-800-357-0910. Ed Klein is author of Blood Feud, the Clintons versus the Obamas. It's number one on the New York Times Bestseller List. It surpassed Hillary Clinton's book, and there are a lot of people who are coming after Mr. Klein right now because of writing this book. Remember, we went over that article yesterday. Richard Cohen in Real Clear Politics wrote, "Conservatives will buy anything," and insinuated that just about everything that Mr. Klein has in this book about the Clintons versus the Obamas is not true, that his stories are totally off base. The Washington Post this morning put in a blog that they had a few weeks ago about Klein and talking about how his work was filled with contempt and adventurous adjectives and often mere the gossipy edges of the books they describe. Politico is hitting them this morning hard. And so we bring in this morning that author of the number one best-selling book in the New York Times, Ed Klein, back here on the Gary Sutton Show. Ed, welcome back. Good to have you.
It's great to be with you. I'm bloodied but unbowed.
Ed, I want to ask you, and I read this article by Cohen yesterday. I'm sure you did too. But this idea that he's saying, there's no way you can get inside these people. There's no way that you can talk about the Clintons and what they really think. There's no way you can get this kind of stuff. And in fact, the point of his article was, you're just right. This is all but, the National Enquirer walking out as an impulse buy out of the supermarket, in essence, and saying, you're just appealing to what conservatives want, and they want to munch on, and it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy. So how do you answer people when they come out with that type of criticism?
Well, I would take it a lot more seriously, Gary, if they were actually attacking the facts in the book, Blood Feud, rather than me, or rather than conservatives, or rather than people who buy my book. You noted, I'm sure, that it's all personal. It's all, invective. It's all like high school schoolyard hurling ugly names at me. But there's no substance to what they're talking about. And again and again in my books that I've written, whether it was The Amateur or now Blood Feud, what I write turns out to be what everybody finally acknowledges is true. Let me give you a perfect example. I wrote in Blood Feud, the Clintons versus the Obamas, that there is this rift and that the Obamas and the Clintons are not only drifting apart, but actually in a feud. And what's happening is Hillary is going out on public and distancing herself from Obama on every issue she can find. Last night she was on Jon Stewart, The Daily Show. Very comfortable place for her to be. He's a very left-wing guy. And she said that the executive branch, and guess who that is? That's the White House, Obama, isn't doing the job it ought to do in working with Congress. So I find this kind of very petty, and it doesn't bother me in the least.
One of the things that bothers a lot of the people right now who are sitting out there, the regular citizen, who doesn't just want to be fed something that feeds their perception, rather it's fact. They sit back and they say, well, how do you know it's true? When Ed writes a story, how do you know it's true? My answer yesterday was, I read his book. I read other books. I read Buzz Patterson's book a few years ago and interviewed him. Guy used to be the guy who carried the nuclear football for President Clinton.
Right.
And he talked about, and I brought this up yesterday, about the fact that he would be on the elevator going up to a function in the White House or downstairs to a function in the White House, and that Hillary would be using language he said that would have made a wharf worker blush. And he said all of a sudden the door flings open to the elevator, and they're both standing there hugging each other and holding hands.
Right.
And so I said, I think you read Ed's book in the context of what other things you want to look at out there. I don't think Ed says read this and believe only this. I think it's a matter of read this book and don't be afraid to read other books too, which might also bring and put all this into some kind of context. What do you think of my answer?
I think it's perfectly right, and you're right. Hillary is known by people who have seen her in private to, as you say, make a sailor blush, and she uses unbelievable 4-letter words and 6-letter words that we can't use on radio, but she uses in private, and then she turns into this, butter won't melt in my mouth person when she's in public. But let's talk about for instance, my report that Oprah Winfrey and Michelle Obama don't get along. I mean, people say, how do you know that? Where do you get this stuff from? Well, first of all, I talk to people in the Oprah inner circle. I talk to people who Michelle talks to, and we see the results of this. Oprah Winfrey did not lift a little finger for Barack Obama in 2012 when he ran for re-election. She did not endorse him. She did not go to the White House when invited to back Obamacare. There is a real sense of resentment on Oprah's part that she's been frozen out of the White House by Michelle and her best friend, Valerie Jarrett. So again and again and again, the stuff that I report is based on, first of all, 50 years of being a journalist, New York Times editor-in-chief of the New York Times Magazine. I ran the magazine. Newsweek, before that, foreign editor. I have a track record of being right again and again, and these people who are attacking are, I think, pathetic because all they can say is, this, how can he prove this? And, he doesn't know what he's talking about. But they don't have any substance.
One of the things I was reading in Politico, there was a guy named Hadass Gold and wrote this piece and took from the Guardian's John Swain. And he says, the opening scene in Blood Feud, the new book by Ed Klein about the Clintons and the Obamas, is a classic of the 77-year-old author's scurrilous brand of political nonfiction. And talks about, on a Sunday afternoon in May last year, we were told Hillary Clinton gathered 6 girlfriends from Wellesley's class of 69 for a boozy lunch at La Jardin du Roi, a bistro near her home in Chappaqua. Klein discloses breathlessly that the wines had been carefully chosen by Raw, I guess is the way you'd say it, the owner of the restaurant, and that Raw waited on Hillary personally and prepared a special vegan dish for her after the former First Lady told him that she was trying to lose weight, unquote. He says, this is, however, a problem with this centerpiece of Blood Feud's prologue because it was not named after the backyard of a man named Ra. It means the garden of the king or the king's garden in French, and the guy's name is really Joe, not Ra. This is not the first glaring factual error to have made its way into Klein's reporting. It is not even the first time a mistake has been made in the very first anecdote of one of the books. Your response there to this particular piece that came out 2 days ago.
Yeah, well... So we're talking about whether the guy's name is Joe or Roy, right?
Right.
Okay. His name is Joe, and his friends call him Roy.
Right.
So you take your pick. Joe, Roy. I mean, if that's the worst, then they can find.
But again, they don't go, and one of the things I think is really rather interesting here is that they do not go to the subject, which was Obama's asleep at the tiller, and some of the other things that she said. They don't go there, but they go to kind of the minutia around it. I noticed even yesterday in Cohen's article that he wanted to talk about the inside of the Clintons' living room and that you had somehow the colors wrong, and he happened to know what the colors were, and he also basically said that they don't talk like this, that there's no way that they talk like this. He can't believe they would talk like this. And again, when you talk about some of the other people, and I've interviewed a lot of people who say, yeah, they do talk like this. At least she does.
They do, and this is from the people who are in the room with the Clintons when they do talk like this. Yeah. This is, you see, one of the problems I find in all of this is interesting. Most of the reporting from Washington is done by Washington-based reporters who are talking to officials in either the current administration, like the Obama administration, or previous administrations, people who used to work for the Clintons. These are all official spokespeople for one side or the other. My sources are very different than those sources. I talk to people, and I've been cultivating them for many, many years, who are in the personal inner circles of the Clintons and the Obamas, not official people who are mouthpieces for them, but they're friends, their associates, their colleagues, their relatives, people who are truly insiders, not just like to present themselves as insiders.
You know, we look at other things that are out there right now, and last week Hillary Clinton went off the trail. I thought it was kind of interesting. She went off the trail after your book took over number one. Not that there's maybe that could be totally coincidence, but maybe she felt that she was also getting a little overexposed out there in terms of who she was. But then I also read this in a piece by Noam Emery this morning. She took a long step toward becoming toxic when tapes emerged, and this was in the last couple of weeks, of a years-old conversation in which she boasted of getting a man who raped a 12-year-old child off with a slap on the wrist. In doing so, she painted the girl as unstable and given to making things up. Ruth Marcus says she was doing her job, but did she have to like doing it so much? Karen Tumulty called her tone swaggering, and that was one of the reasons that she kind of stepped off the trail, a lot of people are saying, because she didn't want to answer those kinds of questions.
That's right. And she was on Jon Stewart last night, The Daily Show, and you can be sure that Jon Stewart didn't ask her about that. That tape recording, which is from the 1980s, when she defended this rapist,
right,
who raped this 12-year-old girl, and is cackling, classic Hillary cackle, about how he took and passed a lie detector test, and that this made her no longer believe in the authenticity of lie detectors. Isn't that funny? Ha, ha, ha. Well, it's not funny when somebody rapes a 12-year-old girl and you defend that person and get a big kick out of it.
We're talking with Ed Klein, author of Blood Feud, The Clintons versus the Obamas, number one on the New York Times bestseller list. Ed, let me ask you a question straight up. Do you hate the Obamas and the Clintons? You've written about a lot of different presidents and different people.
No.
What's your motivation?
Well, my motivation is to expose the true side of the people who are in charge of our country. Our country is in a lot of trouble right now, both domestically and in foreign affairs. I don't think there's anybody who's listening to your show who wouldn't agree with that we have more problems than anyone seems to know how to deal with. Who are the people in charge? They're Barack Obama, Michelle Obama, and their best friend, Valerie Jarrett. Who are they, and what are they like, and why do they make the decisions they do? That's my motivation. It's to get at the truth of who's in charge and what they're like. And then the Clintons want to get back into the White House. They already had 8 years in the White House. Bill and Hillary want back in. Do we want them back in? What are they like? What are they in truth when the elevator door is shut and people don't see them? What do they really say?
And in a time when we're having a difficult time trusting people in our own institutions, obviously you're not surprised that there are people who are going to come out and attack you and say, we don't trust you either. You know, we don't trust anybody because we seem to be lined up on such a polar ends here that we want to believe whatever we want to believe about our people, and don't you dare put a tinge on that at all.
That's true. And, it's interesting. Years ago, I wrote a book about the Kennedys called The Kennedy Curse. Mm-hmm. And I wrote about the dysfunction in the marriage between John F. Kennedy Jr. and his wife, Carolyn Bessette, and how they were using drugs and how they were talking about divorce and so forth. At that time, the entire Kennedy PR machine came down on me and said, how could he know this? It's not true. Well, books have been written, articles have been written since then, confirming every word in my book. This has been true of all my books. I must say that with no exceptions, the stories that I tell finally are confirmed by people who follow in my footsteps.
Ed, we're going to take a minute here, and we're going to come right back to you here on the Gary Sutton Show. Get some final thoughts. Ed Klein, the author of the number one book in the country right now, The Clintons versus the Obamas, Blood Feud. And it is just surpassed Hard Choices last week or 2 weeks ago. He'll be right back with us here on the Gary Sutton Show as we ask him more questions about this book and his sources and the attacks on him right now here on the Gary Sutton Show on News Radio 910 WSBA. Welcome back to the Gary Sutton Show on WSBA. We're with Ed Klein, who is the author of Blood Feud, The Clintons versus the Obamas. Ed, what have been the strangest reactions you've gotten so far? Have you gotten calls from people threatening? Where has this all gone since your book has kind of taken off?
No, I haven't gotten those kinds of calls, and I hope I don't get them. I have gotten, as you pointed out earlier in the show, these personal attacks. What I think is interesting is that everyone knows in their heart of hearts that the Clintons and the Obamas don't get along very well.
Mm-hmm.
Everyone has known that for a long time in Washington. No one in the mainstream media has been willing to touch that story because either they're in the tank for Hillary or they're in the tank for the Obamas. And now that I've surfaced this blood feud, I think you're going to see more and more talk about, for instance, Elizabeth Warren, the very far left-wing senator from Massachusetts, as a possible opponent of Hillary in the nomination process.
And that's already out there this morning and been out for a few days now, yeah.
That's right.
New rising star.
Yeah, and that's what the Obamas are encouraging. They want somebody to challenge Hillary to knock her off because they don't want the Clintons in the White House because they feel, the Obamas do, that if the Clintons get back in, they're going to undo some of these very far left-wing policies that the Obamas have been following for the last 6 years. And the Clintons, as you know, come from a different wing of the Democratic Party. They come from the center-left wing.
Because they're a more pragmatic type wing than does President Obama.
Perfectly said, exactly. And Obama's from this far-left wing. He wants to turn America into a European-style social democratic state, as does Elizabeth Warren, by the way. And so it's hardly surprising that there is as much of a feud in the Democratic Party as there is in the Republican Party between the Tea Party people and the establishment wing of the Republican Party. So you asked what has the book accomplished, and I think it's accomplished this book, Blood Feud, has accomplished surfacing the truth about what's going on in the Democratic Party.
One of the looks at people in this country today, and I think it's a real conversation that we're having, is are we pretty gullible and stupid? Are we just led around? Do we just read one thing and say that's it? Or is there more to it? And I was looking at this Cohen piece yesterday, and I wanted to give the line to you and just kind of have you react to it. He said, now I feel something ought to be done for the poor, innocent conservative. What I recommend, says Cohen, is a federal agency, the Conservative Protection Commission, CPC, with an appropriate headquarters in Washington and, of course, a fair number of regional offices more in the South than, say, the Northeast for obvious reasons. I mean, really, sarcasm dripping. I recognize this is a liberal solution to a conservative problem, but truly, these people need help. They will buy anything. And Klein, talking about you, clearly knows this. He's a former editor of the New York Times Magazine, a one-time member of the Manhattan Literati. Yet, to the dismay of his friends, he turned out books designed, or so it seems, to pick the pockets of the gullible. Your reaction?
My reaction is that for years and years, people who were not liberal in this country, who were conservative, who were independents, had nowhere to go for their information other than to the mainstream media. Now we have, thanks to talk radio like yours, we have Fox News, we have the Wall Street Journal, we have the New York Post. So now we have some outlets that are giving the other side of the story. And that's exactly what my book, Blood Feud, does.
I was reminded a couple years ago, and people said to me, what's the difference between talk radio and the news, for example, as it's presented to you in terms of opinion, which is kind of the end of the business I'm in? And I said, when you get the news through one portal, it's very varnished.
That's right.
When you get it from regular people who aren't afraid to talk Main Streetese, it's very unvarnished. And to me, unvarnished is the biggest compliment you can pay.
Well, I hope people think of my book as unvarnished, because that's surely the way I want it to be seen.
When you look at where the book is going right now,
yeah,
and I would ask you one final question. If you would have gone out and started to do your research for this book, which obviously takes a lot of research, and you would have had some of these conversations that you allude to in the book, and they would have led somewhere else, and you'd have said, oh, my God, it's nothing like I thought it was, would you have still written the book?
Absolutely. Yeah. I go where the truth leads me. Absolutely.
So it's not like the present-day opinion journalism where we write our headline and then we say, okay, now let me go get the facts that conveniently fit in here and make this look good down the line, right?
That's not been the way I was trained at the New York Times and at Newsweek, when the New York Times and Newsweek were still straight organizations, which they no longer are, of course. But when I was there many years ago, we let the facts speak for themselves, and that's what I do in Blood Feud.
What would you tell people out there in terms of how they should read Blood Feud, what they should do at the end, where they should go with this whole thing?
Well, first of all, they can get it at Amazon.com, which is a big discounted book, Blood Feud, and they can get it at Barnes & Noble. They can get it at Books A Million, everywhere. I think it's important for when they finish reading this book to come to their own conclusions and to get in touch with their representatives and express their opinions in letters, in emails, in phone calls, and in their vote.
And don't be afraid to follow up and check out other sources, too.
That's right.
Along the way. I think that's one of the things, both pro and con, but go with the idea, as I think you did here, of this is where the path is going to lead. It's going to lead somewhere. We'll just find out where it leads at the end of the day. The name of the book is Blood Feud, The Clintons and the Obamas, #1 on the New York Times bestseller list, the must-read of the summer. And we hope you'll get out there and pick it up. Ed, we'll look forward to talking to you again soon, and continue good luck with all the barbs and arrows and the sales of the books as well.
Thanks so much, Gary. Hope to be back with you soon.
Pleasure. Thank you, Ed. Take care. Ed Klein with us here on the Gary Sutton Show on WSBA. What are your thoughts?